Good morning and welcome to the next in the series of SASB webinars on the individual sectors. Here we have our food, agriculture, and beverage sector. Michael Kinslick, head of the standard setting organization at SASB, here with Levi Stewart, sector analyst for our consumption one sector. We're going to take a few minutes to review SASB's approach to standard setting. Then I'm going to pass it off to Levi to go into some detail about the consumption one sector and some of the upcoming changes for the standards and metrics there. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps in the SASB standard setting process and leave some time for questions and answers at the end. I'd like to encourage you to get your questions in now, and we'll get to those at the end of our webinar. So first point is that SASB's approach to standard setting is rooted in the U.S. definition of materiality according to the Supreme Court and well-established securities law. We take that approach to ensure that we're aligned with companies' existing reporting requirements, as well as helping investors get the information they need to make the decisions relevant to the investment process. Our approach to standard setting starts with evidence. We look at both news items, financial statements, industry documentation, all kinds of things to find out what issues are investors and industry participants considering as material to their performance. We look at the potential to create value in those issues in our materiality determination. We ensure that those issues are relevant across an industry, not just company specific. We determine that they are of interest to investors, actionable by companies, that it's something that a company can reasonably affect the operations or performance on, and ensure that these are reflective of broad stakeholder consensus in their materiality. We want to also ensure that the topics and metrics we're looking for are decision useful for investors in their decision-making processes, so we try to streamline our approach, as well as keep those cost-effective for companies to report on. The SASB standards and metrics, unlike other reporting frameworks, are designed for inclusion directly in the mandatory regulatory filings here in the United States. So the 20F filings, the 10K filings for US issuers, and 40F for Canadian. These accounting metrics are intended to be incorporated into the management discussion and analysis portion of the 10Ks, where it will not necessarily need a full audit review, but can be processed through an assurance process or attestation process. Our evidence basis for materiality starts with, and Levi will get into a little more detail on this, but we start with a broad approach of identifying issues that might be of interest, and then filter those down through intensive research, understanding the nature of the impact on valuation, vetting those issues through public comment periods and participation through market participants, and then finally validation through looking at what's actually being reported by in-company 10Ks and 20Fs, and finally with deep analytics and data on the potential impact of those topics and metrics. And I want to stress that these are things that affect companies in different ways. It's not just major impacts on potential liabilities, but opportunities for revenue generation by meeting customer demands in health and nutrition, for example. It's managing cost and resource scarcity by ensuring that distributors are monitoring their fleet fuel and energy management. It's looking at environmental impacts across the supply chain and a host of other ways of impact that these topics can affect corporate value. Finally now, pass it over to Levi for a deeper dive into the consumption sector itself.
Hello everybody, and thanks for joining today's webinar. We'll go into the consumption one sector. And when I say consumption one, what I really mean is a host of industries that are commonly referred to as consumer staples. So these are 7 industries that are made up of agricultural products, meat, poultry, and dairy, processed foods, non-alcoholic beverages, alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and household and personal products. And within these 7 industries, there's really several themes that cross-cut, but 2 that stick out. And that's health and nutrition and other consumer welfare themes, as well as the environmental and social impacts of the supply chain. When we take a broader look at all of the disclosure topics within the consumption 1 sector, what we see is, again here, several different themes cross-cutting the sector. So these are everything from environmental topics such as energy and fleet fuel management, and that is really relevant to companies nearly throughout the sector, water management as well, food safety concerns, and the packaging life cycle management. If we take a look at the current state of disclosure, you can really see the importance that SASB brings to the table. The SASB's goal can be summed up here in that we want to move the needle from the red or non-disclosure and boilerplate, the salmon-colored disclosure items, to the darker colors, such as the dark gray, which is a metrics-based disclosure. In terms of disclosure here within the consumption 1 sector, it's quite well, it's doing fair enough in terms of recognizing the topics, with just under 80% of the SASB topics being recognized within the 10K. But the quality of that disclosure we really see is lacking, in that nearly 70%, just about 2/3 of the disclosure, lacks really any sort of industry specificity or metrics that really would give investors the insight they need to make a comparative analysis amongst companies. So if we look, for example, at tobacco, what you see is more quality disclosure in terms of being industry-specific, metrics-based. Nearly everything has that industry specificity, and there's really no topic SASB's identified where there's no disclosure. However, if we look at something like processed foods, we see a little bit different of a picture, with a large portion of the disclosure being boilerplate and a small percentage being based on metrics. And when we drill down into the processed foods industry, we see how this varies across the topics that are present within that particular industry. So when we take a look at food safety or health and nutrition, the topics are more well disclosed, with 40% using an industry-specific metrics-based approach. However, when we look at something like packaging lifecycle management, although every company within this industry has recognized the materiality or likely materiality of the topic within their Form 10K, all of the language is boilerplate, which really leaves investors to guess how the issue is being managed. And what's important to point out here with these charts is that this is all based on current SASB analysis of regulatory filings. So these are the SEC forms 10K and 20S, and this particular data is as of August 2014. And we're looking at the top 10 companies within the processed foods industry. So now we have a little idea in terms of where the current state of disclosure is. I want to take a look at the provisional standards for consumption and give you an idea about how these standards were developed and how they can be useful to companies and investors alike. What's really important to SASB's approach is taking an industry-specific approach. And so when we look at what we had pointed out earlier is health and nutrition or customer welfare as being one of the major cross-cutting themes in this sector, it's really important to take this sector or industry-specific approach within the sector and start to look at the topic at a closer level. And when you do so, it really becomes clear the best way to capture performance for different companies really depends on the industry. So for instance, in processed foods, we're calling for disclosure on revenue from products labeled or marketed to promote health and nutrition attributes, whereas for non-alcoholic beverages, we're really looking at what's the revenue from zero and low-calorie beverages, those beverages with no added sugar, and those that have been artificially sweetened. These are really aligned with the trends that we see within that industry and the various approaches companies are taking to address health and nutrition concerns. Similarly, in tobacco products, we're looking for revenue from smokeless tobacco, revenue from non-burn tobacco nicotine devices, and revenue from other tobacco harm reduction products. Understanding that companies within this industry are also approaching health and nutrition, or rather customer welfare in this case, in a terms of opportunity for revenue growth. And this is really the approach that SASB has taken to developing metrics to capture performance that'll be beneficial to investors. So when we look at the evidence that's been developed for these various sustainability topics, what you see here is a nice breakdown of how SASB develops evidence to support its various topics. And the development of these metrics and topics are really based on this evidential-based approach, which provides a strong basis behind each of the disclosure topics. So when we look at something like the HM or heat map, what that is it's an algorithm that SASB has developed to search through company filings, legal reports, and various other news sources to highlight the topics that are really being talked about the most within the industry. So in this case, aligning with what we've noticed, health and nutrition has the highest heat map score and is really talked across the processed foods industry in numerous filings and various avenues. So Form 10Ks, CSR reports, as well as other news and media that we've been seeing. From that heat map, SASB's worked to develop the topics into a more clear and outlined approach, and through that we've suggested the topics and the metrics to industry working groups. And so what you see there in that second column is the percentage of industry working group participants that agree with the likely materiality of a particular topic. So in this case, food safety, 100% of participants agreed, and I think that everyone can be clear on why that is the case. Very important to the ongoing operations of a processed foods company to maintain that food safety, and it's good standing both with its customers and regulators. From there, we also look at the evidence of financial impact and the various channels of financial impact that can occur through. So when we look at something like energy and fleet fuel management, what we really see is, this is an impact on costs, as Michael had pointed out earlier, and maybe to a degree cost of capital in terms of any risk or exposure down the road. Whereas if we look at something like food safety, it really cuts across the various financial channels. So it certainly can impact costs through recalls, it can impact liabilities through lawsuits, and then can impact cost of capital if we see that companies are at a higher risk of food safety events. From there, we look at forward-looking impact as well. So how are these topics going to expand in terms of probability and magnitude or other externalities, and whether that's likely? I think this is really important to consider when we look at these sustainability impacts. I've heard it referred to as pre-financial information. I think it's a really great way to go about it. These are things that are likely to increase in importance, and it's really valuable for investors to consider as they're looking to the future and how companies may be impacted by their performance on sustainability topics. So looking at the current state of disclosure, we saw a lot of kind of high-level data, and I think it's always interesting to dig down and see what this actually looks like. So, as we point out here, it's an evolving world, and the standards are really meant to evolve with this sort of changing environment. And what's interesting to note is when it comes to health and nutrition, there's a lot of companies that have really done pretty amazing things and have recognized the value of this topic to their business and its ongoing ability to generate revenues. So for instance, the disclosure you see in front of you is from Pepsi's 2015 Form 10K, and it acknowledges the various aspects of health and nutrition and the valuable points that they've made in terms of generating revenue from that. However, when we looked at the 2016 filings, this wasn't really there or acknowledged, so we lack that consistency and comparability. And that's part and parcel to SASB's approach, is maintaining the consistency and comparability across the various channels. So right now, what you see in front of you is a range of disclosure items, and the first two are actually from Form 10Ks in the year 2014. And we had highlighted the industry-specific approach earlier and the metrics approach as well. And I think it's interesting to point out, the industry-specific approach it acknowledges in this instance that water management, is an increasing risk, and it can deteriorate, leading to increases in production costs and lead to capacity constraints. It doesn't necessarily highlight how it's being managed, and it kind of leaves investors wanting more information in terms of what's being done to address these issues. When you take a look at the more metrics-based approach, you see that some of these concerns are mitigated. The company here has identified its total water use, so an investor can understand the scale of its impact, and it's identified the areas where this can be troublesome in terms of water that's used in stressed areas. However, the one point that's really lacking here, I think, is that this isn't comparable across companies, and it's it's not really noted what the gross exposure is to water-stressed regions, which is really important when you're considering production cost increases or capacity constraints and the scale to which those could impact a company. And that's where the SASB metrics come to be really beneficial. SASB metrics, allow for normalization across an industry. They're comparable for peers and really promote the idea that one company can be benchmarked against another, and highlight how investors, or improve investors' insights into how one company performs compared to others. And here is a good example of how this data can be used. What you see is the water intensity for the 8 largest alcoholic beverage producers that we've been able to find on Bloomberg. And it's really interesting when you start to take a look at these things. You can see the clustering of alcoholic beverage companies around this, what's considered an industry best practice of 3.2, and you start to see a little bit more of a spread, allowing you to understand what companies are performing well on this topic and what companies may be able to improve their performance. And you also, I think it's important to understand that everything needs to be taken in the greater context or operating environment. So in this case, where you see Diageo further down towards 6, it's important to consider that they're a distiller, whereas many of the other ones are a beer producer or brewer. And obviously that production process is inherently more water intensive. So these sustainability topics and the metrics that SASB has developed are really one way to add information to the total mix that investors have and to improve their insight, but of course should be taken in light of that. And that leads me to the process that SASB is currently undergoing, which is the hypothesis for change. So we've developed these provisional standards, and right now we're noting areas where we think there are potential changes that could improve the quality of the standards. So to take a look at an example of what I mean by that, when we look at the meat, poultry, and dairy industry, we've found that the labor practices topic, while we had a worker health and safety topic, it didn't necessarily encapsulate various labor practices. And review of the industry's common human capital issues really highlighted that there are significant concerns regarding labor practices, including worker treatment and issues with fair compensation, treatment of migrant laborers, and efforts to block employee unionization. So SASB's proposed that based on this information, we should add a topic that encapsulates labor practices and as well add a metric to address that topic and cover the amount of legal and regulatory fines and settlements that are associated with labor law violations, as we've seen that to be the predominant channel through which financial impact happens. Just an interesting quote that helped us find this information and the evidence that we've used so far to help develop the hypothesis for this change was for a CRS report for Congress, which noted that 60% of surveyed plants, and those are meat and poultry plants, had violations of wage and hour and safety laws. So it seemed that it was really relevant across the industry, and that's why we've been able to highlight this as an issue to look into further. And just as we've proposed to add topics or add metrics, we're proposing in some instances to remove a metric or topic. So another example of the hypothesis for change that's been developed for this consumption one sector is for the processed foods industry, and specifically for the health and nutrition angle. And so we've suggested removing one of the metrics here, and that's a metric that's on revenue from products that meet smart snacks in school or the foreign equivalent. And the basis for this was really re-examining the metrics and the rationale we had developed for the metrics, and understanding that the school cafeteria environment or segment for companies was a relatively small subsegment, may not depict information that's necessarily material to an investor, and the companies were already addressing these issues and basically within 100% agreement with the smart snacks in school criteria for those products that were sold to schools. So based on that and additional evidence that we researched, for instance, an NYU nutrition professor had pointed out that really the smart snacks in school may not be a great criteria to begin with in terms of understanding whether or not food should be considered better for you or healthy and nutritious. We've proposed to make this change to the standards by removing this particular metric. So now we're going to talk about the next steps in SASB's process. I'm going to hand it back over to Michael to go through that.
Thanks, Levi, and also just wanted to remind everyone, if you have questions for either myself or Levi, to get those in at this point. So as Levi mentioned, over the coming 2 quarters, we're going to be engaged in a deep consultation process with members of industry, with members of the investment community, and with independent experts. So we'd encourage you now also to contact Levi and the other sector analysts for review and feedback on the standards and metrics that we're proposing. So this process, if you can sort of think about the folks I just mentioned as being in the lower left there, we think about that there's sort of the foundation of providing SASB with our mission of producing the standards that are fit for purpose for both investors and issuers. Our board will be seating an independent standards council that the standards setting organization will owe its ultimate allegiance to, and that standards council will have the ultimate authority over the standard setting process and the contents of the standards themselves. The board will also have a review mechanism for potential violations of due process via a standards oversight committee, but that committee is not intended to actually participate in the standard setting process itself, simply to ensure that the Standards Council and Standard Setting Organization are doing their work effectively and appropriately. So this will, these broad processes will take place over the coming 12 months or so. We'll have about 6 months of deep engagement with issuers and investors and other experts, then a public comment period when everyone will have an opportunity to share their thoughts on the standards and proposed changes, after which we will move to codify the standards into the initial SASB code, and again, that should happen approximately a year from now. So just to highlight that process here, so we are now in this whole process over the coming 12 months, and we encourage everyone to engage with that process directly with us and also in our public comment period. I'd also like to mention we recently announced the formation of our investor advisory group, consisting of asset owners and asset managers, leading ones like BlackRock, Goldman Sachs Asset Management, State Street Global Advisors on the asset manager side, and folks like Ontario Teachers, CalPERS, CalSTRS on the asset owner side. We'll be announcing more members of that body leading up to our initial SASB Symposium, which I'll share more about in a minute. Also want to say, SASB does have a network of support products and materials for investors, for issuers to kind of think about the standards. We issue technical bulletins and implementation protocols for the standards themselves, Our materiality map is still up on our website so that folks can look and see which are the issues and topics that are most relevant in their industry. We support the engagement with the market via our FSA credential. We've gotten great feedback. We're going to have our first class of fully credentialed FSA Level 2 passers coming soon. We also have our engagement guide for investors to think about talking with companies about these issues and topics. We have our implementation guide for companies to think about how they would report on the topics and metrics, and then we have an integration guide for investment managers to think about how they would use the SASB topics and standards in their investment processes. Finally, we've recently launched the SASB Navigator, and that is something you should all take a look at. We're going to be having webinars to describe the deep functionality in that, and we'd encourage you to go to the website and take a look at what's going to be happening with that. So as I mentioned, we're having our first SASB Symposium on December 1st, Thursday, December 1st in New York City. I would encourage all of you to come attend that. We're going to have a great roster of speakers on the topics of corporate governance and materiality and ESG integration, so definitely something not to be missed. And with that, we're going to get into the Q&A portion of our webinar. Again, I'd encourage you to get your questions in now. So first question, a very topical one here, Levi. So given that today is election day, are there any emerging regulations that could impact companies in your sector?
Yeah, definitely a relevant question for the day. A couple of regulations that I've seen coming on various ballots I think are really interesting for this sector. One being the soda tax that's proposed. It's proposed in 4 different cities, 2 here within the Bay Area, Oakland and San Francisco, 1 in Colorado, and another within the Central Valley of California. So 4 different cities across the United States are voting on whether to accept or pass a tax on the sale of soda or sugary beverages. I think that's really relevant today, as we pointed out, the metric on sales from basically sugar-added beverages, and I think that's an interesting topic for investors to consider because early results have shown from previous taxes passed within Mexico and Berkeley that this has led to a decrease in consumption of soda. So I think it's really interesting to understand various companies' exposure to these sorts of taxes or regulations that are seeming to be increasingly present within our regulatory environment. The other really interesting regulation that's on the ballot today was in Massachusetts and whether or not to pass a cage-free egg requirement. So California has a similar regulation in place and is really relevant for industries such as meat, poultry, and dairy and their management of the cage-free egg issue. So I think those are 2 really interesting issues that are relevant today, being that it's an election day.
Thanks. Yeah, and that animal welfare issue might see other angles besides the cage-free egg one as well.
Yeah, certainly. Several angles are really relevant there. Cage-free eggs being relevant to the poultry industry, but we're also looking at things like gestation crate-free pork, and I think it's a really interesting topic and one that we're seeing increasing regulatory and consumer demands for.
Great. Next question. You mentioned the state of disclosure in the 10Ks. Are there other disclosures happening in CSR reports, and what does that look like?
Yes, certainly. I can speak to that. There is. So we talked about 10Ks, and SASB's mission is really to have the sustainability information reported in the 10K. State of disclosure in CSR reports is different. We definitely see a more quantified industry-specific approach there. But the challenge being that the way that it's messaged is really kind of disparate in that I often see one issue acknowledged as being, say, a risk within the 10K, not really acknowledged how that risk is being managed, and then we see within the CSR reports that yes, indeed, maybe the risk is being managed well with a quantified disclosure. However, investors really aren't able to access that information in a quickly at the fingertip click through their investment terminals, and at the same time that information that is disclosed within the CSR reports doesn't lack the same scrutiny and really robust procedures that we see going into the 10K, and so the data there has really lacked comparability across the industry.
Great, thanks. I'd also add that it also, when you don't have a regular reporting structure around these issues, you also don't get comparability across time, because a company might report the topic one way in the CSR report and then the next year a different way. Next question. How would the standards in the agriculture, food, and beverage sector relate the risk of climate change to food production systems?
Yeah, definitely a top-of-the-mind question, really strong question to ask. So we cover that in several different areas. So when we think about agricultural production, obviously we consider it within the agricultural products industry, and we look at things like companies' exposure to water-stressed regions, and really the risks that are present within the top 5 commodities that they produce or that they source. Similarly, when we look at down the supply chain a little bit towards processed foods and non-alcoholic beverages, we're considering a more general discussion and analysis approach, just because there are so many different ways that climate change can really be addressed. So asking for companies to identify their various mitigation techniques to account for climate change and their strategies to mitigate it, and also asking for exposure to drought and water-stressed regions as well.
Great. Here's one. How do the SASB standards address seafood, since it's not a standalone industry?
Yeah, and that's an area that's been a little challenging, honestly, for SASB. The current state is one which there aren't U.S. publicly listed companies that own seafood operations. So while it's a hot topic, it kind of falls on the outside of SASB's mandate to develop metrics and standards for U.S. publicly listed companies. However, we still find that U.S. listed companies are exposed to seafood through their supply chain. So we're considering those types of exposure within processed foods companies, as well as within our services, or within our consumption 2 sector and the food retailers. And we're calling on companies to disclose such things as percent of products that are certified by to a current standard. So things like the Marine Stewardship Council that really try to address issues within the seafood supply chain, and working to capture that, as well as various supply chain audits through our processed foods companies.
Great. One more. Given the standards are meant for use in public filings, how do they account for or relate to all the privately held agricultural production and distribution in the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess before I answer that, I would say that this is an area that SASB is currently looking to address through our hypothesis for change. So one that I think will see some evolution, and we're always excited to take feedback on that. So I encourage feedback through that process. But currently, SASB is looking to address these topics again through the supply chain. So we're looking at agricultural producers and seeing what they can do to affect operations within the on-farm production processes. So we're asking for disclosure on things like exposure here to pesticide regulations through the supply chain, water use within the supply chain, and any sort of other crop efficiencies that may be able to be passed on by the agricultural products companies to their producers. And then similarly, we've seen that processed foods companies have strong relationships with privately held companies or farmers that do the on-the-ground farming operation. So here too, we're asking for those processed foods companies to disclose percentage of foods that are certified to environmental or social credentials, as well as a discussion on any sort of efforts being done to improve the on-farm operations.
Great, thanks, Levi, and thanks to our audience for listening. That was our last question. This webinar will be available online for re-listening, and we look forward to your continued engagement with SASB.